The night was cruel. The wind screamed across the frozen land, carrying sharp ice crystals that cut like knives. A blizzard raged without mercy, turning the world white and endless. The stars above were hidden, and the moon could not shine through the thick storm. It was a night meant to swallow all hope. In the middle of that storm, a small figure moved slowly. She was only a child, but not a human child. Her skin was pale blue, glowing faintly under the snowflakes. Her large eyes, the color of silver, blinked against the wind. Her hair, tangled and wet with ice, clung to her thin face. She wore nothing more than torn cloth, not nearly enough to fight the cold. Her small feet sank into the snow with every weak step. She trembled, her body shaking as if it would break apart at any moment. The alien child cried out, but her voice was weak, nearly stolen by the roaring storm. "Please." Her broken words carried into the emptiness. Her language was strange, but the sound of pain and fear was clear in any tongue. She hugged herself tightly, trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth inside her. Her tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. The village lay not far behind her. Wooden houses stood with lights glowing faintly inside. The warmth of fires burned behind closed doors. But no one came for her. The villagers had heard her cries earlier, and they had turned away. They whispered to each other that she was cursed, unwanted, better left to die in the storm. Fear and cruelty kept them hidden while a child suffered outside. The blizzard grew harsher, throwing snow against her tiny body. She stumbled and fell face first into the frozen ground. Her hands dug into the snow, trying to rise, but her strength was fading. Her lips moved, whispering words that no one answered. The storm swallowed her voice, leaving only silence. Time slowed for her. Every second felt heavier than the last. She thought of the faces that had once smiled at her, now turned away in disgust. She thought of warmth, of arms that should have held her but never did. She thought of sleep, sweet deep sleep where the cold would no longer hurt. Her body begged her to rest, but her heart refused to give up completely. She wanted someone, anyone, to see her, to hear her, to hold her. The snow piled around her small form. The white world wanted to bury her, to erase her from existence. Her breathing grew shallow, her chest rising and falling in painful rhythm. Her glowing eyes slowly closed, heavy with exhaustion. Darkness pressed at the edges of her vision, but even in her weakness she cried once more. It was not loud, it was not strong, but it was real. A thin, broken cry that carried through the storm. "Help!" The storm answered with silence. The houses in the distance stayed dark and closed. The child curled into herself, too weak to rise again. Her body shivered violently, then slowed. Her silver eyes looked to the sky one last time, as if praying to stars that could not be seen. Her heart whispered a final plea. "Please don't let me die alone." Her breath was nearly gone when something shifted in the storm. Far away, faint footsteps crunched in the snow. They were steady, stronger than her own. The storm wrapped around the sound, almost hiding it, but still there. A shadow moved in the blizzard, tall and broad against the swirling white. The child's eyes opened slightly. She could barely see through the falling snow, but she thought she saw movement, a figure in the distance walking against the storm. Her heart fluttered weakly. Maybe it was only the wind playing tricks. Maybe it was hope making shapes in the snow. But she wanted it to be real. She needed it to be real. Her lips parted, though no sound came out this time. She reached one trembling hand forward, fingers stiff and blue from the cold. She tried to wave, but her arm fell back into the snow. Her eyes closed again, tears freezing on her lashes. The storm howled louder, as if it wanted to cover her completely. But the footsteps came closer. The figure moved with purpose, pushing through the blizzard. The shadow grew larger, clearer. Heavy boots pressed into the snow. A cloak whipped in the wind, a face hidden by frost. The figure was human. The child did not know this yet. She did not know that the storm had carried her cry to ears that still cared. She did not know that her life was about to change forever. At that moment, she only knew the cold, the fear, and the loneliness. But in the distance, hope walked toward her through the storm. The blizzard did not frighten him. The human had walked through many storms before, though none had ever felt this merciless. Snow bit at his face and clung to his thick coat, but his steps never slowed. His boots pressed deep into the white ground, leaving marks that vanished quickly as the storm swallowed them. He leaned into the wind, his broad shoulders carrying a heavy pack. Every step was a battle against the cold, but he kept moving. His name was Marcus. Once he had been a soldier on distant worlds, fighting wars that were not his own. Now he was a traveler, a wanderer with no home but the road. He had come to this frozen land seeking quiet, away from the noise of battles and the weight of bloodshed. But even here, far from war, the world still whispered of suffering. As Marcus pushed forward, he heard something unusual. At first, it was only the wind, howling like an endless scream. But then, under the roar of the blizzard, he caught it, a sound faint and fragile. A cry. He stopped, his breath fogging in the freezing air, his ears strained against the storm. There it was again, broken and weak, almost swallowed by the snow. A child's cry. Marcus frowned. No child should be out here. No one should be. He turned his head, scanning the storm. The snow was so thick it felt like he was trapped in a wall of white, but instinct guided him. He had followed dying voices before, on battlefields where the wounded begged for help. Too many times he had been too late. He would not let that happen again. He moved toward the sound, every step heavier as the storm fought him. His cloak whipped in the wind, ice clinging to his beard. The cry grew softer, fading as if life itself was slipping away. Marcus's chest tightened. He forced himself faster, his boots crunching louder against the snow. Then through the curtain of white he saw it. A small figure half buried in the drifts. The child lay curled in the snow, trembling so faintly it was almost invisible. Blue skin glowed softly beneath the frost. Silver eyes fluttered half shut, struggling to stay open. For a moment Marcus froze. The child was not human. Alien features marked her face, her small hands, her fragile frame. He had seen many alien races during the war, some kind, some cruel. But none of that mattered now. What he saw before him was not an enemy. It was a child, alone and dying in the storm. Marcus dropped to one knee beside her. "Hey!" His voice was rough but urgent. "Stay with me, little one. Don't close your eyes." The girl stirred faintly, her lips moving though no sound came out. Her tiny hand lifted weakly, fingers brushing against his gloved hand before falling back into the snow. Her skin was ice-cold, fragile as glass. Marcus's heart clenched. Without thinking, he pulled his heavy cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around her small body. She shivered, her silver eyes opening just enough to see his face. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked, her fear meeting his determination. He lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, light as a shadow. He could feel the faintest heartbeat, weak and slowing. "You're not going to die out here," he muttered, his jaw tight. "Not while I can still move." The storm pushed harder, as if angry at his defiance. Snow stung his eyes and the wind roared in his ears. Marcus lowered his head and shielded the child with his body, moving carefully through the storm. His boots slipped on hidden ice, but he kept his balance. Every step was a fight, but he would not stop. The village lay behind him, but he had no trust in it. He had seen the way lights stayed shut while cries went unanswered. No one there had opened their doors to the child. He would not carry her back to those who had abandoned her. Instead, he turned toward the hills where he had passed a ruined cabin earlier in his travels. Broken old but still standing, it would have to do. The child stirred again, whispering faint words in her alien tongue. Marcus could not understand them, but he understood the sound. A plea, a question, a desperate hope. He tightened his hold on her. "I've got you," he said softly, his voice calm despite the storm. "You're safe now." Her head rested against his chest. The warmth of his body and the shelter of his cloak gave her strength enough to breathe a little easier. Her eyes closed, but this time it was not with despair. It was with the fragile comfort of being held. Marcus pressed forward, the cabin's shadow forming ahead in the swirling snow. His breath came in heavy clouds, his arms steady around the small girl. The storm raged, but inside his chest a fire burned, a fire that would not let him give up. He pushed through the final drift and reached the cabin door. It groaned against the weight of the storm as he shoved it open. Inside, the air was still and dry, though cold. Dust lay thick on the wooden floor. The remains of a fireplace waited in the corner. Marcus stepped in, closing the door hard against the blizzard. For the first time that night, silence returned. He looked down at the child in his arms, her face pale but alive. "You'll be all right," he whispered. He set her gently near the fireplace, wrapping her tighter in his cloak. Then he began searching for wood, for fire, for life. Outside, the storm screamed in rage. But inside, in the arms of a human stranger, the alien child had found her first spark of hope. The cabin was dark and cold, but it was better than the storm outside. Marcus knelt near the old fireplace, his hands working quickly. He pulled wood from the pile he had gathered earlier in the day, stacking the pieces carefully. His breath came out in clouds as he struck his flint. Sparks danced in the dark until finally a flame caught. The fire slowly grew, light spilling across the dusty room. Warmth spread from the flames, weak at first, but growing with every crackle. Shadows ran across the walls, chasing away the deep cold that had filled the place for years. Marcus leaned back and let out a slow breath. The fight outside was not over, but for now they had a small corner of safety. He turned his gaze to the child. She was still wrapped in his cloak, her tiny frame lost inside the heavy folds. She looked so fragile it hurt to watch. Her lips were pale, her hair damp with melted snow, her small hands stiff with cold. Yet her chest rose and fell, slow but steady. She was alive. Marcus moved closer, crouching beside her. "Come on, little one," he said softly, his voice steady. "The fire's here. You're safe." Her silver eyes opened just a fraction. They glimmered faintly in the firelight, reflecting fear and confusion. She stared at him, unsure if he was real. For a moment, Marcus saw the mistrust there, the kind of mistrust born from betrayal. She had been left out there to die. Why should she trust another stranger? He slowly reached out his hand. His gloves were thick, but he pulled them off, letting his bare skin feel the cabin's chill. Gently, he placed his hand near her small fingers, not touching, just waiting. The child blinked. Her eyes darted from his hand to his face. She trembled, her body caught between fear and need. For a moment, she pulled her hand back into the cloak. But then, as the firelight warmed her face, her hand moved again. Slowly, weakly, she stretched out her icy fingers and placed them on his palm. Her touch was light, fragile, almost nothing. But Marcus felt it as if it carried the weight of 1,000 battles. It was not just skin against skin. It was trust, thin as glass, fragile but real. "The first touch, you're safe," Marcus whispered again. His hand closed gently around hers, careful not to frighten her. He rubbed her cold fingers softly, trying to bring back warmth. She flinched at first, but then she let her hand rest inside his. A small sound escaped her lips, a whisper in her alien tongue. Marcus did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of a child who wanted comfort, who wanted to believe she was no longer alone. He shifted her closer to the fire, keeping her in his arms. The cloak wrapped around both of them now, sharing his warmth with hers. She leaned her head weakly against his chest, her silver eyes half closing again. The storm outside roared against the walls, but inside, a fragile silence grew. Marcus sat still, holding her, his eyes fixed on the fire. He thought of the villagers who had turned away. He thought of the wars he had fought, the innocent lives he had failed to save. A sharp ache filled his chest, but this time he would not fail. The child shivered again, whispering faint words. Marcus bent closer, listening. She repeated them, voice broken but soft. He could not understand, but the way she said them, it sounded like a name. Perhaps her own, or perhaps the name of someone she had lost. He nodded gently, as if to tell her he had heard. "You don't have to speak," he said. "Rest. You're not alone anymore." Her breathing slowed, evening out as warmth began to return to her body. For the first time since he had found her, she looked less like a shadow of death and more like a child clinging to life. Marcus did not move. He kept her close, his hand resting gently on hers. The fire crackled, filling the room with the rhythm of survival. The storm outside was strong, but the bond formed in that small cabin was stronger. As the hours passed, Marcus felt her relax little by little. The stiffness left her hands, the trembling eased, and her breaths grew deeper. She even made a tiny sound, almost like a sigh of relief. Her fingers curled faintly around his, as if she feared he might vanish if she let go. Marcus looked down at her and for the first time in years, felt something stir inside him. Hope. He had walked through the galaxy carrying only scars, never expecting to feel anything but emptiness again. But here in his arms was a fragile life that had chosen to trust him. It was small, but it was enough. The child shifted once more, whispering a single word in broken, quiet voice. Marcus could not understand, but he thought it sounded like warm. He smiled faintly. "Yes," he murmured. "Warm." And with that, she closed her eyes fully, not in despair, but in fragile peace. Marcus sat there, holding her, his hand wrapped around hers. The storm could rage as long as it wished. Inside the cabin there was fire, Inside his arms there was life, and between them in the silence of survival there was the first touch of trust. The storm outside clawed at the walls, but the cabin stood firm. Inside the fire crackled brighter, filling the room with flickers of orange and gold. The warmth began to push back the icy grip of the blizzard. Shadows danced across the wooden beams and the air no longer felt like death. It felt alive. Marcus sat close to the fire with the child still wrapped in his cloak. She was lighter than a feather in his arms, but he held her as if she were the most important treasure in the galaxy. Her breathing was slow but steady now, her small chest rising and falling like a fragile rhythm of survival. He watched her closely, afraid her strength might fade if he looked away. Her pale blue skin shimmered faintly in the firelight, no longer lost under the frost. Strands of her hair, silver with ice, began to thaw and fall softly against her face. She looked peaceful, almost like a sleeping angel, though her thin body told the story of cold and hunger. Marcus reached into his pack, pulling out a small tin cup and a wrapped bundle of dried food. He had planned to ration it for his travels, but one look at the child was enough. She needed it more than he ever could. He melted snow in the cup over the fire, waiting until steam rose. He cooled it carefully, then touched it to her lips. At first, she did not move. Then, with a faint sound, she opened her mouth and sipped. The warm water slid down her throat and a soft sigh escaped her. Her eyes fluttered open, silver orbs glowing faintly as they met his. She drank again, weak but desperate, as if the warmth of the water gave her hope. "Easy," Marcus whispered, steadying the cup. "There's more. You'll be all right." The girl's voice trembled as she whispered in her alien tongue, words Marcus could not understand. Yet her eyes spoke clearly. Gratitude, fear, wonder. She looked at him as though he were a miracle she did not believe could exist. Marcus tore a piece of dried bread and softened it near the fire. When he offered it to her, she hesitated. Her hand trembled as she reached, then pulled back. He realized the truth. She had been turned away so many times that kindness now felt like a trap. He broke off a piece and placed it gently to her lips. "Eat," he said softly. "It's yours." Slowly she obeyed. The first bite was small, almost cautious. Then as the taste reached her, she took another and another. Her hands, weak and shaking, finally reached out. He placed the food in her palms, watching her nibble with a hunger she could no longer hide. As she ate, her eyes softened. Her body relaxed little by little, as if the fire, the food in his arms had finally convinced her she was safe. She leaned against him, letting the heavy cloak cover them both. For the first time, she did not flinch from his touch. Marcus sat in silence, letting her eat and drink until her strength returned. His mind wandered, but his eyes never left her. He thought of the villagers who had locked their doors, leaving her to die. He thought of his own past, of all the young faces he had seen lost to war. He clenched his jaw. He would not let this child be another memory buried in the snow. After some time, she whispered again. This time her voice was clearer, though Marcus still could not understand the words. He tilted his head, meeting her eyes. She hesitated, then placed her small hand on his chest right over his heart. Her touch was light, but her meaning was strong. She was asking if she could trust him, if he would stay. Marcus placed his larger hand gently over hers. "Yes," he said softly. "I'm here." The girl gave a small nod, her silver eyes shimmering with fragile hope. She curled closer, resting her head against him. The storm outside thundered, but inside the cabin, warmth wrapped around them both. Hours passed, but neither of them noticed. Marcus fed the fire whenever it dimmed, each spark chasing away the cold. The child drifted in and out of sleep, always waking to find his arms still holding her. Slowly, her breaths deepened, steadier than before. At one point, the wind outside grew so fierce it shook the cabin walls. The girl startled awake, her body tensing with fear. Marcus tightened his hold, lowering his head so his voice reached only her. "It can't touch you in here," he said. "Not while I'm here." Her small fingers clutched his cloak tighter. For the first time, her eyes closed, not from exhaustion, but from trust. Marcus leaned back against the wooden wall, keeping her secure in his arms. He let the warmth of the fire soak into them both. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. Not the emptiness of war, not the cold of wandering, but the simple truth of connection. The storm raged on, but the cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a promise. A fragile bond had been born there, built on firelight, food, and the first shared warmth of survival. As the girl slept, Marcus whispered into the quiet room, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "You're not alone anymore. Not ever again." And with that vow, the cabin became more than just broken wood. It became a sanctuary, a place where a dying child had been given life again, and a man who had lost all hope had found it returned in the smallest, most fragile hands. The night deepened, but the storm did not rest. Snow slammed against the cabin walls, and the wind howled like a beast clawing at the door. Marcus sat by the fire, the child curled close against him, wrapped in his cloak. She breathed quietly now, her small face calm in sleep. For a while, the only sounds inside were the crackle of firewood and the faint sighs of her breath. But then, something changed. Marcus had lived too many years on battlefields to ignore the warning that crawled up his spine. The storm's voice carried more than wind. Beneath the roar, he heard it, footsteps. Faint, muffled by snow, but there, more than one. Moving outside the cabin, he stiffened, his hand automatically reaching for the knife strapped to his belt. He listened, holding his breath. The footsteps circled slowly, crunching in the snow, then pausing. He glanced at the girl. She stirred faintly in her sleep, unaware of the danger. Marcus rose silently, lowering her gently onto the bundle of cloaks by the fire. She whimpered, but the warmth soothed her back into rest. Moving with careful steps, Marcus crossed to the window. He brushed frost from the glass with his sleeve and peered into the storm. Shapes moved in the blizzard. Dark outlines, tall and hunched against the wind. There were 3, maybe 4 of them. They carried spears or staves that glowed faintly with blue light, cutting through the snow. Their movements were slow, searching, their heads turning like hunters in the night. Marcus's jaw tightened. He understood now. These were the ones who had left the child in the snow. Not strangers wandering the storm. No, they were looking for her. But their steps were not filled with care. They were filled with intent, sharp and cold. The firelight flickered across the girl's face. Even in her sleep, she seemed uneasy, as if some part of her knew the shadows were near. Marcus whispered under his breath, "They're not here for love." The wind carried voices now, low and muffled by the storm. The words were alien, sharp sounds that Marcus could not understand. But the tone was enough, commanding, impatient, cruel. He had heard that tone before, from leaders who ordered soldiers to finish the weak. He stepped back from the window, his knife still in his grip. The cabin was old, its walls thin. If the strangers forced their way in, it would not hold them for long. He looked at the girl again, so small and fragile beside the fire. She had already been abandoned once. He would not let her be taken again. The door rattled suddenly, snow dust shaking loose from the frame. Marcus moved in front of it, his broad frame a wall between the child and the storm. The rattling stopped, replaced by silence. Then came a heavy knock 3 times. Slow, intentional. Marcus's voice was steady, though low. "This place is taken." There was no reply. Only the whistle of wind and then another knock, louder this time, shaking the door. The girl stirred, waking with a soft gasp. Her silver eyes opened wide and frightened. She looked toward the door and a quiet word slipped from her lips. Marcus didn't know her language, but he understood her fear. "They won't touch you," Marcus whispered firmly. "Not while I'm here." The door shook again, harder. A voice called out, harsh and cold. The girl whimpered, curling closer to the fire. Marcus's grip tightened on his knife. He knew he could not fight a group head-on, not without weapons or cover. But he also knew something they did not. He had faced worse storms than this, both in weather and in war. He pulled the cloak tighter around the girl, kneeling beside her. Her small hands reached out, clutching his sleeve. He placed a steady hand on hers. "Listen to me," he said softly. "No one takes you tonight. No one." Her silver eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded faintly, trusting him. That single look of trust gave him more strength than any weapon could. The shadows outside moved again, circling. Their glowing staffs pierced the snow like restless spirits. Marcus could hear them dragging across the ground, testing, waiting. He stoked the fire suddenly, feeding it more wood. Flames leapt higher, spilling light against the cracks of the walls. The warmth grew stronger, and with it the cabin seemed to defy the storm. He wanted the girl to see light, not darkness. He wanted her to know that even if the world outside had abandoned her, someone inside would stand. The door rattled one last time. Then just as quickly, the shadows pulled back. The crunch of footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the storm. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was victory enough for the moment. Marcus exhaled slowly, lowering his knife. He turned to the child who still clung to his sleeve. Her breathing was fast, her eyes wide, but she had not screamed. She had held on just as he had. "They're gone for now," Marcus said, his voice calm. "But they'll be back. And when they come, we'll be ready." He sat beside her again, pulling her into his arms. She pressed against him, trembling, but her heartbeat began to slow under his steady warmth. Outside, the storm raged and the shadows lingered unseen. Inside, by the fire, a promise burned brighter than the fear. Marcus whispered into the silence. His words not just for her, but for himself as well. "If they want you, they'll have to go through me first." The girl closed her eyes again, her small hand gripping his tightly, and in that fragile shelter, surrounded by firelight and shadows, the bond between them grew stronger than the storm itself. The fire burned bright, but Marcus knew its warmth would not be enough for what was coming. The shadows had left the cabin for now, but he had not mistaken their intent. They would return, stronger, angrier, determined to take the child back into the storm. He could feel it in the silence outside, the kind of silence that meant danger was only waiting. The girl sat close to the flames, wrapped tightly in his cloak. Her silver eyes were wide, following Marcus's every move. She did not speak, but her gaze spoke volumes. She understood too. She knew they were not safe. Marcus moved through the cabin, searching. His soldier's mind came alive, the instincts he thought he had left behind returning with sharp clarity. He checked the wooden walls, the broken shelves, the scattered tools left behind by whoever had once called this place home. It wasn't much, but he had to use everything he could. He dragged an old chair across the floor, breaking its legs into sturdy sticks. He tied a knife blade to one, fashioning a crude spear. He stacked the rest near the door, ready to use as weapons. The fireplace poker would serve as iron in his hands, if nothing else. The girl watched him, her small fingers gripping the edge of the cloak. Her body trembled, but not only from fear, there was something else. A flicker of trust, as if she believed he would keep her safe. That trust filled Marcus with a strength greater than any weapon. Suddenly, the storm outside shifted. The wind carried voices again, closer, louder. Harsh commands in the alien tongue. Then came the glow, faint blue lights cutting through the blizzard. They were back. Marcus knelt beside the girl. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, speaking softly. "Stay here. Stay by the fire. No matter what happens, don't move." Her silver eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded. Her small hand reached for his, clutching it tightly for a moment. He squeezed her fingers gently, then stood, turning toward the door. The first blow shook the cabin, snow falling from the beams. A second strike rattled the door on its hinges. Marcus held his spear tight, his muscles tense. He had faced enemies with guns and machines, but never had a battle felt this personal. This was not war for land or power. This was war for one small life. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. Cold air and snow exploded into the room. Figures filled the doorway, tall, cloaked, their staffs glowing with eerie light. Their eyes burned with cruel intent as they stepped inside. Marcus did not wait. He lunged forward, driving his spear at the first intruder. The crude weapon struck true, forcing the figure back into the storm. Another swung a glowing staff at him, but Marcus blocked with the iron poker, sparks flying as metal clashed against energy. The cabin erupted into chaos. Shadows moved like predators, their voices sharp and cruel. The fire roared, casting wild light across the fight. Marcus fought with everything he had, every strike, every block, every breath. His arms ached, his chest burned, but he stood his ground. One of the figures broke past him, reaching for the girl. She screamed, curling tighter by the fire. Marcus roared, hurling the poker across the room. It struck the figure's shoulder, knocking him back. Marcus charged, slamming into him with his full weight. The intruder fell, crashing against the wall. Marcus turned quickly, his body shielding the child again. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his eyes burned with fury. "You'll never touch her!" he shouted, his voice shaking the cabin walls. The intruders hesitated. They had not expected resistance. They had not expected a human to fight for her. Their cruel confidence faltered. For a tense moment, the storm itself seemed to pause. Then slowly the shadows retreated. One by one, they backed into the blizzard, their glowing staffs fading into the white. Their voices carried once more, but now it was anger, not command. The storm swallowed them, leaving only silence and snow. Marcus stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his spear broken in his hand. His body ached, his breath burned, but he had held. He had not let them take her. He closed the door slowly, shutting out the storm. His eyes turned to the girl. She sat by the fire, her small hands clutching the cloak, her silver eyes wide with fear and something else. Awe. She had seen him stand for her, fight for her, refuse to abandon her as everyone else had. Marcus dropped the broken spear and knelt beside her. He reached out, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "It's over, for now," he said softly. Her lips trembled. She whispered a word, faint but clear. Marcus did not know her language, but he thought he understood its meaning. It was not a word of fear. It was a word of belonging. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She clung to him, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt. The fire warmed them both, and though the storm still raged outside, inside the cabin there was strength. A bond forged in battle. Marcus whispered into her hair, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "No matter how many come, they'll never take you from me. Not now, not ever." And in that promise, the cabin became more than shelter. It became a fortress, held not by walls of wood, but by the unyielding stand of a man who refused to let the cold win. The storm raged through the night, but Marcus did not sleep. He sat beside the fire, his back against the wooden wall, his arms wrapped protectively around the child. The glow of the flames danced across their faces, chasing away the shadows. The girl clung to him, her small hands gripping his shirt as though afraid he might vanish. Outside, the wind howled and snow battered the cabin, but Marcus did not let go. He had fought for her, and he would fight again if needed. Yet as the hours passed, the storm slowly began to weaken. The howl turned to a whisper. The pounding on the walls softened. The long night gave way to something new. When the first light of dawn broke through the cracks of the wooden boards, Marcus finally allowed himself to exhale. The storm was ending. The world beyond the cabin was no longer just white chaos. It was touched with the soft glow of sunrise. The child stirred in his arms. Her silver eyes opened, faint and tired but alive. She blinked at the sunlight breaking through the gaps, her face softening with wonder. For the first time, she was not met with endless darkness. She was met with morning. Marcus looked down at her, giving a faint smile. "See?" he said gently. "The storm's gone. It's a new day." She blinked again, then slowly lifted her small hand. She pointed toward the light spilling into the room, her lips parting. A faint word escaped, a whisper Marcus did not understand, but he did not need translation. He knew she was saying what her eyes already showed: hope. He rose carefully, lifting her into his arms once more. She was still weak, but no longer on the edge of death. Wrapped in his cloak, she pressed close against his chest as he opened the cabin door. The sight outside was breathtaking. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world covered in pure white snow. The land stretched out endlessly, quiet and still, untouched by cruelty for this single moment. The sky glowed with soft gold and pink, the sun breaking through heavy clouds. It was not a dead world anymore, it was alive, shining with promise. The girl gasped softly, her silver eyes wide. She reached out a trembling hand toward the light, her fingers stretching as though she could touch the sun itself. Marcus held her steady, letting her see the beauty she had thought lost forever. They stepped outside, their boots sinking into the fresh snow. The cold was still sharp, but it no longer bit with death. It carried a clean freshness, a promise of survival. The girl clung to him, her head resting against his shoulder, her breath misting in the morning air. For a moment they simply stood there, watching the dawn. The silence was not heavy now. It was peaceful. Marcus lowered his head slightly, speaking softly to her. "You're not alone anymore. Not in the storm, not in the cold. Wherever I go, you go." The girl tilted her head, meeting his eyes. She whispered something again, slower this time, as if trying to make him understand. Marcus listened closely. He still could not make sense of her alien words, but one sound was clear, repeated again and again. It was not just a word. It was a name for him. Marcus felt a warmth stir in his chest. She had given him a place in her world, not as a stranger, not as a rescuer, but as someone she chose to keep. He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "All right then," he said quietly. "If that's my name to you, I'll keep it." The girl's lips curved into the faintest smile. Her first real smile since he had found her in the snow. They walked forward together, leaving the cabin behind. The blizzard had erased the footprints of their enemies, burying the past in silence. Now only two new trails cut through the fresh snow, one large, one small, side by side. As they moved into the light of morning, Marcus felt something he had not felt in years, a sense of home. Not in a place, not in walls, but in the bond he carried in his arms. The child rested against him, her small fingers holding tightly to his hand. Her silver eyes looked at the horizon with quiet wonder. For the first time, she was not crying in the storm. She was walking into the dawn, safe in the arms of someone who would never abandon her. Marcus whispered one last vow into the cold morning air, a vow only the snow and the sun could hear. No matter what comes, I'll keep you safe. From the storm, from the shadows, from everything. You're mine to protect now, always. And with those words, they stepped into their future, not as a soldier and a lost child, not as strangers bound by chance, but as family. The world ahead was uncertain, but the bond between them was unbreakable. In the heart of the blizzard, they had found each other, and in the light of a new dawn, they began again.